the land acknowledgement. So I will just do a very brief introduction of the series for anyone who's new to it and introduce Andrea and then hand it over to you, Andrea. So Literatures of Annihilation, Exile, and Resistance is an interdisciplinary research collective and lecture series focused on questions of human rights and the arts. It's co-sponsored by the College of Arts and Letters and by the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies. And it's housed at the Initiative on Race and Resilience at Notre Dame, which is directed by Mark Sanders, Professor of English and Africana Studies. We're really grateful to our partners. We have a lot of partners, too many to name, but we're especially grateful to the Transnational Literature Series at Brookline Booksmith for co-hosting this event and all of our events this year. So Andrea Topash-Rios is Associate Teaching Professor of Spanish in the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures, and her work focuses on community-based learning, literacy, and language development, as well as preservation of Indigenous languages and cultures in colonized societies. Thank you so much, Andrea, for being willing to join us today and for conducting a land acknowledgement.
Azareen. Bojo Jayek, Wibin Gana Nagus Kwe, Indigenakas, Gigos Adodum, Pokegnek Borowadamik. Warm greetings and welcome to all gathered here. I'm Andrea Topash-Rios, citizen of the Pokagon Band of Potawatomi, Fish Clan, and faculty in Romance Languages here at Notre Dame. Thank you for having me. This is the home of our ancestors. We've been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so.
Thank you, Andrea. And my apologies. I would just like to remind everybody to mute their microphone so that we can hear our speakers. Unless you during Q&A, you can unmute to ask a question. Of course, we'd be happy to hear your voice then. Okay, so thank you, Andrea. And I am going to briefly now introduce our guests, Orlando and Thirii. So Thirii Myint is the author of a novel, The End of Peril, The End of Enmity, The End of Strife, A Haven, published in 2018 by Noemi Press. And she won an Asian Pacific American Award for Literature for that book. And she's also the author of a book of creative nonfiction, Names for Light, A Family History, which was the winner of the 2018 Grey Wolf Press Nonfiction Prize and was named one of Kirkus Review's best books of 2021 and was a finalist for the 2022 PEN Open Book Award. She's an assistant professor of English at Amherst College in Amherst, Massachusetts. And we are dropping the link to our guests' books in the chat box. So we encourage you to check that out and go ahead and purchase their books. Orlando White is from Tolican, Arizona. He is Diné and the author of 2 books of poetry, Bone Light, Red Hen Press, 2009, a book that Kazem Ali described as a careful excavation on language and letters and the physical body, and Letters from Night Boat Books, 2015, which received the Poetry Center Book Award. Orlando White teaches at Diné College and lives in Sale, Arizona. And today's event is co-moderated by one of our own MFA students in fiction, Armand Chowdhury, who is also a graduate student affiliate for Literatures of Exile. I just want to welcome our guests again and say how pleased I am to have 2 dear friends, Orlando and Thirii, in conversation with us today. And Orlando, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, Shea Orlando White, that's a June. Is it Hobahan, Slit Auto, Nakai, Dene, Bush's Chin, Achini dashache aro kiani dashanala. Hothakanda edena sha. Eya gutao denenishla. So I'm going to begin a reading with a really short essay, and then I'll move into some of my new work that I'm exploring. So the title of this particular piece is called "To Find the Subject by Leaving the Subject: Expectations of Race and Content." In 2005, when I was an undergraduate in creative writing, I entered a poetry residency contest. One of the competition's rules was that the applicant must be of Native American descent. A couple months passed and I received 2 letters. One thanked me for submitting my poetry and congratulated me on making 4th place. The other was filled with comments by the final judge. In the second letter, the first paragraph stated that my poems are repetitive in style and form, and that the line breaks, line lengths, word spacing distract from the subject matter. In the next 2 paragraphs, the letter mentioned that the poems have no centralized theme except language itself and unfocused connections to shapes of letters and punctuation and bones and skeletons. But the most interesting part of the evaluation was in the 4th paragraph where the judge wrote, "I would ask this writer to think about what is important to him as a Native person and to incorporate these values within the poetry." When I read that sentence, I thought, so I guess my poems don't know what it means to be Native American. At the same time, I also wondered why the judge hadn't considered the art of it as having leverage and importance. I suspect that for her, the themes should have been centered around Native American viewpoints and concerns such as oral tradition, identity politics, or land and sovereignty. In my mind, poetry does not have to address subject matter directly, especially if one creates art as an exploration of imagination through language. As anyone who has ever talked to me knows, I have strong opinions about racial politics, but when I write a poem, ideas of race as subject matter do not directly come to mind. I am much more interested in language and its deep sense of immediacy. I'm not saying I don't think about race. I do, or have not experienced prejudice or racism. I have. I'm only saying when it comes to writing, my intuition and intellect gravitate toward aspects of craft instead. One can argue language is always connected to race and vice versa. This may be why my poems ultimately reflect an intersection of Dene thought and English fluency. But I find my sensibilities are attuned to how a poet builds their poems, rather than focusing on content, which may overwhelm a poem. Yet this is not to say that I believe one must avoid ideas of race entirely or sacrifice content. Rather, it is to say there are a myriad of ways in which a poem can navigate those issues on the page. In the essay, Writing Off the Subject, the poet Richard Hugo suggests that we quickly leave behind what he called the triggering subject, by which he meant the subject we thought we wanted to write about, and let sound carry us to a truer engagement with the world. Or as Hugo put it himself, never write a poem about anything that ought to have a poem written about it. A wise man once told me, not bad advice, but not quite right. Subjects that ought to have poems have a bad habit of wanting lots of other things at the same time, and you provide those things at the expense of your imagination. As a reader and listener, I am most mindful of hearing sound, experiencing imagery, engaging form, feeling and emotional intensity, and understanding the intellectual urgency within the language of a poem. When I read Santi Fraser's mangled poems from his first book titled Dark 30, for example, the mangled poems are a series of poems that follow the protagonist, a man named Mangled Creekbed, through various episodes of his life. It is language I respond to first. Almost every one of the poems is in prose block form, but one can still hear the sonic intensity and tightness of its poetic lines. As in this excerpt from the poem Mangled Letters and the Target Girl, in which Fraser explores the sound of words within the line while at the same time reinforcing the content through the movement from monosyllabic to multisyllabic words and the disruption of conventional syntax to reveal Mangle's particular way of engaging the world. Only to hoot, to speak flitting blade in the dark, mouth able to sound verb for thing, him chicken eat, not know, gallop, but for sound, stud but for nodding haunches, tipping its body, arching its head toward dirt, chewing, hay under a ranch that, bean juice skin tight as saddle, leather, neck stiff as a coffee can, as lanterns go out, stud fed and tied to posts, Mangled piles up some hay, rests his bones for the long day of pounding tent stakes. In an interview, Fraser comments on how Mangled began as music first and only later developed into a character. This idea of transforming sound into being is interesting when you consider that the word person is formed from per, which means through or by means of, and son, which is the root of sound. Mangled, the character, though fictional, is cast through sound as a real person. As a circus performer who throws knives, who loves comic books and a heavy drink, whose face resembles a skillet, and who constantly finds himself involved in undignified adventures and prolonged solitude. He is an embodiment of movement and rhythm discovered through line and craft. And the only reference Fraser makes to Mangle's ethnicity is when he describes him as having bean juice skin, a phrase that acts as a kind of anodyne interpretation of race. But when we read Fraser's sentences first, rich in sound and cadence, we can begin to see that poetic language could possibly subvert and transcend readers' expectations. And if Richard Hugo is right, the writer's own expectations of race and content in poetry as well. So that was a short piece I wrote, sort of centering around the idea of, how race and identity, fit within the context of craft when it comes to writing poetry in particular. So I'm going to share a few new work that I've been working on. So So I have a series of poems that I've been working on recently, which I call Dene, one-word poems. And these poems are more based in sound and also in visual poetry or concrete poetry. And they're written in my language, which is Dene Kazan.
She did? Yeah. Why? Not tell.
So here is my first piece. Sadla, adla, adla, gla. Wa, to, ish, 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 hush, ish, ish.
Here. Ooh, it's time. What's this sound?
Hojo, hochfon. Nazbas, nanamas, nazbas, nanamas, nazbas, nanamas, nazbas, nanabas. Nalsos, diyoga, che, hunte, yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Orlando. That was wonderful. Again, a reminder to please mute your mics unless you're a guest speaker or a moderator, because if there's any background noise on your end, we can hear it, and it gets sort of muddles our guest speaker's voice a bit. Thank you, Orlando, and we'll pass over to you, Thirii.
Wow, that was incredible, Orlando. My heart is racing. Thank you so much. It is such a pleasure to get a chance to read with you, and thank you so much, Azareen, for inviting me today. For those of you who don't know, I am a Notre Dame alum, so it's exciting to return to God's time and the Golden Dome in this virtual way. Also, people may not know this, but I was an undergraduate at Brown when Orlando and Azareen were MFA students, and I admired them from afar. for a couple years. So it's really exciting and humbling to get to be in company with you now. I'm Thirii Myo Myint, and I wish that I was sharing new work today, but actually I decided to read from Names for Light, my book of creative nonfiction that Azareen mentioned. And it's subtitled A Family History, but it's also sort of a personal history as well. And it traces different places where I have lived and where my ancestors have lived. But before I read from Names for Light today, I wanted to bring some other Burmese diasporic voices into my reading. So I have two little sort of epigraphs that I'm going to share. And the first is from this chapbook called Giving Alms by Kinchen Maymount. And I just want to read from her author's note at the beginning. And then the second source I'm going to read from is From the Land of Green Ghosts by Pascal Coutue. I'm also going to read a little paragraph from sort of the first chapter or the second chapter of this memoir. So these are just to kind of, give you a sense of some of the feelings and thoughts that went into Names for Light that these other writers have so eloquently put together for me. All right, so the first one. My personal journey as a writer became to uncover and make visible the innate humanity that is often lost in the milieu of time and modernity. Narrative and representation is a matter very close to my heart, especially stories which are not tainted by rose-colored lenses. It must also be mentioned that most works about Myanmar available in the international market are often stories surrounding the military regime. There is much to be said about the culture, diversity, and the complexity of a people other than just our military history. Many may patronize Myanmar, cast us to be the destitute character, typecast to be a political prisoner of our own dark history. As a young Burmese writer, I acknowledge history, but reject the notion that it should define a whole people's narrative. I write these stories for my grandmother, great-grandmother, and for all those women before them and those who have yet to come. In a way, I have come home to them, holding their true stories in my heart and crafting those I share with you now with a humility and empathy that they have passed down. I hope you enjoy this anthology as much as I have writing it. Kinchen Maymount. Burma proper, its history and politics, had not yet intruded into my tribal world, where our own legends preoccupied me. Each time I listened to my grandmother's stories, I could almost hear the voices of the ancestors and feel their presence. To the Padang, truth and myth are not the same thing, but nor are the myths simply stories. The myths do not just remind us of the ancestors or teach us about them, they make our lives and those of our ancestors contemporaneous. Through our daily activities and ceremonies and in the telling of these stories, our past is alive to us and we can talk to those who went before. Yet I was between two worlds, the beginnings of my Western, or at any rate Christian education by the priest, and the mythical history of the Padang. So I also felt like an exile or a traveler lost between two unfamiliar shores. As they told the stories, my grandmothers were not as I knew them day to day. They had disappeared. There was no trace of complicity between their daily selves and their selves as storytellers. They may even have made up some of the stories or parts of them, but in being told in this way, the stories entered the world of our myths. The grandmother's words, their pauses to spit, their meanderings as the narrative developed, their hums and undulatings frightened me. They were talking about things that had a deeper meaning for all of us than the grandmas could fully understand. So the grandmas were like vessels through which the traditions passed. This was the shamanistic traditions of our peoples. And I think that second one is especially important to me because one of the pieces of feedback I kept getting when I was workshopping what eventually became Names for Light was that the book was kind of serious and poetic, whereas I'm apparently very goofy and funny in my daily life. And my friends and classmates would always be like, I just wish your book would be more goofy like you. And I don't know why, but for me, I really resisted that. And no matter how much I tried to put that part of my personality into the book, it just wouldn't come through. And I think when I reread Pascal Tutwe, I kind of realized that it's because for me, this book is taking place in a different register. And it's not this ethnographic project of me explaining what it's like to be a Burmese American, right? It's a different project altogether. But anyway, so just a content warning that it will not be funny, but bear with me. So I'm just going to read from the beginning, which is the first chapter, and it's called Leimyana, which is the ancestral home of my maternal side. My great-grandfather died a man, but was reborn as me. He died in a small village in the jungle, hiding from war. The village where they hid was called Leimyana, 4 Faces, a village built around a pagoda of the same name, bearing a 4-faced Buddha. It was my great-grandmother's village, the place where she was born. The city where I was born was also once a place to hide, Yangon, the end of Yan, of peril, enmity, strife. It was a place where there were no enemies, where enemies could not follow. Except enemies did follow, so that by the time I was born, the city had been conquered thrice by the British, the Japanese, and the military junta. 3 enemies to symbolize the 3 torments of the mind: greed, aversion, delusion. My great-grandfather's death was foretold by a trunk that slipped off a bridge and fell into the river upon the family's arrival in the village. My great-grandfather's trunk full of his precious things. The son of a princess, my great-grandfather had inherited diamonds and rubies, sapphires and pearls, jewels my mother had never seen, but had heard her mother talk about with remorse, for all the jewels were eventually sold one by one to educate my great-grandfather's sons. Many years after my great-grandfather's trunk fell in the river, my mother dreamed 2 trunks were thrown into the artificial lake in the center of the city where she had married my father on a floating mythical bird. My mother was inside of one trunk, my brother in the other, and both trunks were coffins sinking into the lake, filling up with cold water. And in the dream, my mother tried to scream, to break out. She threw her body against the lid of the trunk, kicked and clawed, but it would not open, and she could not breathe, until finally she ceased to struggle. She accepted her death. And as she closed her eyes, the trunk opened, and her body floated to the surface, alone in that cold water. When my mother awoke from the dream, she knew that my brother would not live. Except my brother did live, since he returned as my eldest sister, who was born with a birthmark on her foot in the same spot where my grandfather had placed a thumbprint of ash on my brother's foot before he was cremated. There are no marks on my body from a previous life. Unlike my eldest sister, I was born perfectly blank, perfectly bare. For years, I waited for a mark to appear, a sign of who I was or had been or would become. I searched my body, read and reread it carefully. The sharp point of a tooth, the shape of my hands, the places where I could not bear to be touched, my back, my pelvis, under my chin. I was afraid to change my body in any way, to leave my own mark upon it. I got no tattoos, no piercings. I never dyed my hair. And the one time I had it chemically straightened, I shaved it off afterward. I believed I had to keep my body plain and pristine if I was to receive a sign. As a child, I conflated my great-grandfather's body and his trunk of possessions and imagined it was he who slipped off the bridge and fell into the river. I imagined the water turning pink where he hit his head on a rock, the water carrying him away downstream, then around a bend, so my great-grandmother and grandmother could no longer see him. All rivers lead to waterfalls or to the ocean, so I imagined my great-grandfather was transported somewhere. No one could follow him. Although my grandmother did try, since she moved south to Yangon, then called Rangoon, a city by the ocean, and my parents and I tried to follow him even farther since we moved across the Pacific. As a child, I imagined that one day my great-grandfather's body would wash up on a beach in Half Moon Bay, the way dead whales, jellyfish, and cows sometimes did. Even when I learned that my great-grandfather had died of a stroke, a blood vessel that ruptured in his brain, even when I learned that he had died sitting in a chair, not drowning in a river, and that for my great-grandfather, dying in the jungle, dying in wartime meant dying in the comfortable ancestral home of his wife, the daughter of a village elder, I could not erase the path that the river had carved in my mind. From under the bridge in Lenyana, south to join the Patang River, then through the delta into the Pacific Ocean, and across it to the shores of Northern California. A path created by my great-grandfather's body, or rather the absence of his body, an absence that I had to fill with my body since I was reborn from him. I do not know if there really is a four-faced Buddha in the pagoda at Lenyana. The name alone made me imagine it. Myint means face or surface, but it could also mean cardinal direction. Maybe there are four Buddhas inside the pagoda, seated back to back, facing the four directions, or four Buddhas in each corner of the temple, or four windows to let in varying amounts of light from the east, west, south, and north. When I learned the cardinal directions in two languages as a child, I thought the English version made more sense. North, east, south, west. It was satisfying to begin at the top and make my way clockwise in a circle, as if time and place worked in the same way. In Bamar, I had to make a cross, east to west and south to north. I understood that the sun rose in the east and set in the west, and that was a day, a measure of time, but I did not understand what the south to north axis measured. In my textbook, there was a picture of a little girl with her arms held out to her sides, facing the sunrise. The girl seemed to suggest that east to west and south to north intersected only at the origin point of a body. South was inscribed on her right arm, north on her left, and west was on her back, which was to me, the reader. Only east floated on the horizon before her, drawing her gaze and mine. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Thirii. That was so beautiful. And thank you again, Orlando. So I'll go ahead and start us off with a question, and then Armand, who's co-moderating, will jump in. And we definitely have plenty of time to get audience questions. You can feel free to drop them in the chat, or you can hold them and raise your hand when the time comes. One of the things that I was excited about bringing you two in conversation is just the economy of language that you both have in your writing. And there's a line from one of your pieces, Orlando, that I really love that goes, "We only want to be written to have content, but language likes to dress us up, position us next to one another, so we exist as characters." And I mean, I feel like a lot of what you were talking about before you started reading the poetry kind of was unpacking this one sentence in a really powerful way, and how questions of craft kind of get hijacked often from writers of color, and sort of certain narratives get ascribed to the writing, right? Including what you were saying, Thirii, about feeling like you have to apologize for writing in a register that isn't entertaining or humorous, right? When that's not what the work demands, or that's not what this book demands. And then there's the additional problem, and I remember, Orlando, you and I talking about this years ago, of what people expect from you after you've written a first or second book, and this kind of notion that you should always continue down that path, right? As though we only have one authentic voice as writers. And that's kind of sort of some like thinking out loud here, but my question is really about your relationship to the physicality of language and how you both foreground language in your work. And I'm wondering if you can talk about kind of your relationship to language as inheritance, what it means to write the self in it, or to become written by the English language, or to write in the English poetic language. So wherever you want to enter that question is totally fine.
I'll let you go first, Thirii.
Okay, I have so many like half-formed ideas. Really a fantastic question, Azareen. Very generous question. Whew. Relationship to the physicality of language. I think that for me, language has always been plural, because I was raised bilingual in Burmese and English. And that has always, I think, opened up a space for me between language and what language is trying to describe or touch. Like, for example, and my dad was really interested in linguistics, so he would always have meta commentary about what was happening to our brains being raised bilingual, where he would be like, you guys are so special and different because an ordinary child would see a table and have a one-to-one relationship with like this object as a table. But for you, because a table is multiple things, like there is a loosening between the physical reality of the world and the world of language. And I think like I kind of grew up with that, this sort of space and gap between physical things and language. And on top of that, as I started to lose Burmese when we moved to the States, and my parents were working all the time and nobody else was really speaking Burmese to me, I started to lose Burmese, but there was an additional gap that would appear where, as I started to lose the language, like my imagination and brain would fill in that gap as Burmese retreated. I would start to create resonances and feelings about like what a certain Burmese word meant. It became more than just its, more than just its like useful meaning. It started to have a lot of emotional meanings for me that would float as the useful meaning disappeared, if that makes sense. So I think when I'm writing, I'm very aware of all of that that's going on. And especially when I was writing Names for Light, I was very aware that the language that is informing the narrative is this bloated Burmese, this Burmese with a vanishing point of meaning that I had put years and years of like emotional, prescribed emotional meaning to. And I wanted to write with that bloated Burmese. I didn't want to write with a quote unquote accurate or, dictionary Burmese, because I felt like that language was more accurate to like my understanding of the world and of my family stories. And I don't know, I think I didn't want to see that loss of like useful language, or not useful, but like language that's used for communication with others as only a loss. Because for me, I think it's also been, yes, it's true that I have lost my ability to communicate effectively with other Burmese speakers, but I think I've also gained actually like a different type of ability to communicate with other diasporic Burmese people who have had similar experiences of losing their native language. And I don't know, I'm really interested in that sort of liminal space that we're inhabiting. Even as part of me is desperate to relearn Burmese, and regain those tools of communication. I want to think about that loss as not only a loss. That's one thought that came to mind.
Thank you for that theory. That was really interesting. Thank you for the question as well, Ozzy. Yeah, that relationship with language in terms of physicality is, I think, for Diné folks, at least for, like when I think about my own language, which is Diné language. Objects, for example, are just objects in English. They're inanimate objects. But in Diné language, those inanimate objects become animate beings. So one example I like to use is the word computer. So computer is a word in English. It's a thing, right? It's a noun. But our word for computer in our language is besh nsahakes. And so loosely translating besh translates to metal. Nsahakes is the verb, which means is thinking. So what we're really saying is the metal is thinking, or the metal that thinks. So suddenly in our language, objects become alive, right? So that's the physicality, I think, in terms of, me, knowing the language and understanding the language of Diné. That's the relationship I have. If, the physicality could also be sound. So I mentioned sound in that first piece I read, and I also sort of had these sound poems in the second part of my reading. One example is the word hashlish, which I made into a visual concrete poem in our language. Hashlish translates to mud or muddy. So that sound ish is the sound of a foot stepping in mud, right? So if you just sort of imagine, going outside after it stops raining, and you just listen to the sound of when you step into the mud. Ish, ish, ish. So within Diné language, there's also that physicality, right? That relationship in terms of sound. In English, we would call that onomatopoeia, right? So Diné language is sort of rich with a lot of onomatopoeia. So the poetics has always been there, right? The poetics has always that Diné poetics, that native poetics had already existed there within the language itself. So that's that would be the relationship I would have in terms of physicality with language. Even though we don't, my tribe doesn't have a syllabary. We don't have a syllabary like the Cherokee, for example. Our alphabet is based on the Roman and Greek text. So, there's that sort of integration of of a non-native presence, which is English. So our written language is based in the Roman and Greek text. The only thing that's different is that we use a lot of diacritical marks. So we have a lot of high tones, we have a lot of glottal stops, we have a lot of nasal tones, we have a lot of nasal tones, we have /L sounds, you know. So for me, the diacritical marks are important on the page. Like if I were to sort of imagine what sound would visually look like on the page, to me, they would be diacritical marks, right? Those nasal symbols, those /Ls, those apostrophes, those high tones, you know. So, you know, so that would be, you know, that I think that sort of relationship too within Dene language and English, you know, when it comes, you know, at least for me being a poetry writer, and you know, thinking about that relationship and my relationship to both those languages, which is Dene and English. And for me, in my mind, I try not to compare or contrast them too much. You know, sound is sound. There's a lot of beautiful sounds in English. There's a lot of beautiful sounds in Dene. You know, and I like the sort of emergence of both. And I did that with the one word poem that I read earlier, which is the word water. So you know, the word water in English is just water, but in our language in Dene language, our word for water is to. So you know, sort of I just found it sort of fascinating and interesting to put our word for water, you know, in the middle of this English word. So then it was wa to. So that, you know, I mean, when I think of the relationship between native and non-native, in terms of language, you know, that, you know, there's a lot of sort of interesting things that happen. So I hope that answers your question. But
Yeah, of course, more than. I'll pass it over to Armand.
Hi, Thirii and Orlando. Thank you again for joining us. It's such a pleasure and privilege to hear you speak and read. Reading both of your work, one theme or idea that kept recurring to me was that of beginnings. And I wanted to ask both of you how you write beginnings in your work, as in how do you define a beginning or where do you look for one while writing? In Names for Light Thirii, you say, I was always looking for beginnings. The first that was lost, the brother I never met, the country I cannot remember. I'm always looking for the moment when I can enter the stream of myself. And when I read that, I thought it was key to understanding the structure of Names for Light and how meaning is organized in the book. The narrator to me seems to keep trying to define a beginning for her story. Similarly, in your work, Orlando, you're also interested in beginnings and origins. In the poem Nascent, you write, it begins at a diacritical spark of breath and soma. A lot of the poems in the collection letters, they engage with the birth of the alphabet, right? And the lineage of language, if you will. So I wanted to invite both of you to speak a little about how you think and write about beginnings, or how you look for beginnings through your writing.
Orlando, do you want to begin this time?
Sure. So I like to think about, you know, the origin of language. The origin of language in Dene is sound. So I'm very interested in sound. I sort of imagined sound really being the seed for how, I mean, I think it's the first thing that we as being human beings, the first thing we develop, like in such a way where communication sort of expands. I mentioned in the earlier essay about person, per meaning single, once, or through. SON, son as the word is the root for sound. I am a person, you are a person. When we interact, what happens? As we're doing now, we're creating sound. And I like the idea that sound continuously expands, like the universe, right? The universe is constantly expanding, which creates a lot of room for like these possibilities of what we can do with it. I think about poets like B.P. Nicol, who's this Canadian poet, who has these volumes of books that are just sort of expansive in his relationship to words themselves, to sound, them, I think for me, when I think about beginnings, I like to think about the origin of things, especially in particular to sound. Also, when I think about letters, individual letters themselves, one of my favorite letters from the English alphabet is the letter E. So if you take the letter E, the capital E, so if you take the capital letter E and lay it on its back, its pictogram was an image of a person with their hands raised to the sky like that, right? So, you could see, the hands raised to the sky, and then you have the body in the middle, and all you would have to do is just add a head, a body, and legs, right? And so the image of the E was of a person with their hands raised to the sky. Much like the letter A, the capital A, if you flip it upside down, that was its original pictogram. It was an image of an ox head. The letter M, for example, was water. It was a series of wavy lines, and that is the origin of the letter M. So yeah, these are some of the things I like to think about when it comes to I guess you could say part of my process and engaging with with what I do and what I write. So you can go ahead, Thirii.
Thank you, Orlando. And thank you, Armand, for that question. I kind of passed the torch to Orlando because I had needed more time to think about how I would answer it, to be quite honest. I think the first thing that came to mind that I'm still trying to finesse and clarify is, I guess, Buddhist cosmology and Buddhist temporality, because I was raised in a Buddhist animist tradition, and in a very religious, spiritual household, and I think in that tradition, time does not really have beginnings and endings in the Judeo-Christian sense, or really in any sense at all. And in fact, beginnings and endings are pretty much the same. Or like there isn't much of a difference between the two. Because even, for example, something that comes to mind is when I was in high school, and I was a junior in high school taking a class called World Literature. This was always our junior year at the public school curriculum, World Literature. And we were reading something, I don't even remember what, but it had to do with Buddhism. And I made a comment in class about how the historical Buddha is just one of the 5 Buddhas in this cosmological timeline, and that there's infinite Buddhas. And my teacher shut me down and he said, no, you're wrong. Buddha means the one or the only, which, by the way, is completely false. Buddha means the enlightened one. But, you know, I was like 15 and kind of shamed in front of my class. So I think there's very much this sense of like, things are exemplary, and the first, you know, things have to be the first, the exemplary, the origin, I think, to have significance and meaning in, I don't know, in Western, I don't want to even use those frameworks, but in that classroom, let's just say, in that classroom in San Jose, California. And in like my home growing up, like that was not the case, right? Like the historical Buddha is still a meaningful figure, despite the fact that we know that he is one of infinite Buddhas in infinite worlds. Like that doesn't weaken or take away from his significance to my family's like religious spiritual practice. Like he didn't need to be the first to be enlightened in order to have meaning. And so I think that's sort of my relationship to beginnings and endings too, is that I just sort of accept that they're arbitrary, right? But that their arbitrariness does not take away their meaningfulness for people. In fact, it kind of makes it more meaningful because though there are infinite Buddhas, you know, this is the one that we got. And the thing is, they're all different. Like the Buddhas are not identical. They're all different. And they have different qualities, which are now lost to time. But in a way, I don't know. I don't know if I'm making sense, but there's something about that Buddhist like animist way of thinking about time that allows for beginnings to be all the same and all different at the same time, and also for beginnings to be endings. And I'm not trying to make this abstract, because it's not abstract, you know, it's actually a very concrete way of thinking about the world and living. And then I wanted to say one more thing, but now I'm forgetting what it was. Oh yeah, when I was writing the book. So when I was writing the book, I was trying to grapple with how to like kind of get at this feeling of infinite beginnings and sort of contemporaneous timelines, I guess. Like I didn't want to write a book in which it was going to be linear, like here are my ancestors and then here I am, like, you know, the product of them, the telos of them. Like that's not how I think about it. That's not how anyone in my family thinks about it. And so I think I wanted to start at that moment of like saying that I'm reborn from my great grandfather, because I feel like that kind of captured the logic that I was raised in of like, it's not so much that I came after him, but like we're basically the same person, you know, like in a way he came after me because I keep reimagining his life as I live mine. But yeah, there's this sense of ancestors not being in the past, but like literally being in our own bodies, because we are the ancestors, like reborn. Like many Burmese families think that people are reborn from ancestors, despite the fact that, according to scripture, the likelihood of a human birth is supposed to be a needle thrown from the earth and a needle thrown from the sky, meeting midair and touching. Despite that, like every Burmese person that I know thinks that they were reborn from another Burmese person. But given that Burmese people are not that populous, maybe it's true. Like, you know, maybe we're the only ones who are having this experience. But anyway, I kind of love that, you know, this like flexibility of application of scripture to like daily experience.
Thank you. Those are such lovely responses and such a great question, Armand. Thirii, it's funny you say that because I was just thinking about the whole structure of your book relative to like chronological time, right? A linear time. I mean, the story of the ancestors kind of unfolds from past to present, where yours is unfolding from present to past, and it kind of that meeting in the middle, which for me, you know, when I read it as a writer who's also like multilingual, multicultural, multi-ethnic, I think about my relationship to language and time and the multiplicity of origins in which I'm operating, both in real life and on the page. And yeah, and I feel like the language of narrative structure, you know, you want to say in the classroom, not in Western frameworks, however we want to put it, is really quite, I find, constricting if you're an Anglophone writer, right, inhabiting other languages and modes of thought inside of English, where it's literally a different temporal sensibility, right? Like repetition is not just an indicator of trauma on the page, right? It could just be like a different worldview, a different relationship to language and existence. That is, I also find it so much more liberating, right? Like I don't want to believe in that kind of linear causality because it's too stressful, frankly. Like I just want things to keep returning so that I can grapple with them again and again and kind of grow into them over time as a writer. So I'll stop there because we have two great questions from our audience. Armand and I have plenty of other questions that we can bounce back to, but Valerie, if you're still here, would you like to ask your question out loud, or I can also read it? It's up to you.
Sure. I'm glad to ask this question because I just want to say that the experience of hearing you both read was so musical in such complementary ways. And you've spoken so beautifully about the sound of language throughout. It made me think about your relationship to music itself, which I don't distinguish from language itself completely, but certainly we think of it as a different art form usually. I think it's in your art, but I wonder if you could both talk a little bit about your relationship to what we think of as a separate genre of music.
I'll let you answer this one first, Thirii.
All right, that sounds good. We keep following them back to back. Hi, Valerie. It's so good to hear your voice. Valerie was my former and very much beloved thesis advisor, the one who shepherded my first book into the world. So good to hear from you. Music. I actually get this music question often when I read, and it makes me sad because I have no musical education or background whatsoever. And it feels like that's one of the great losses of my life. Like I wish that I could read music or I could play an instrument. I desperately wanted to learn to play an instrument when I was a child, and it was sort of just not possible given the family circumstances. But I have a family that loves music, even though we're also all very musically untrained. But like my parents both love to sing, they both love to listen to music. We would always sing together on like car road trips. You know, like my mom would sing to me all the time when I was young to put me to sleep or just for fun. I would memorize song lyrics and sing them for fun as a child. So I don't know. I think in a way, am like a failed musician or a person who never got a chance to pursue that, and therefore am pursuing it indirectly through writing. Because my writing process is very sonic. Like I read aloud everything that I write when I type it up, not when I'm writing by hand, but when I type it up, I have to read it aloud, record it. And sometimes if I'm stuck, I'll record it, listen to it as I'm falling asleep, and then wake up and keep writing. So it is very musical, but I think I'm very stymied also as a musical person, and it comes out in my writing.
Yeah, music for me is, I think, important in terms of my process. I think of a guitar chord, let's say a G chord and a C chord. Because I play guitar, or I used to play guitar, but not as much these days anymore. But if we look, one of the interesting things that I always think about is the transition between, let's say, a G chord and a C chord. There's a moment of silence. There's a moment of pause in between these two chords. Same with notes. You transition from one note to another. There's that space in between that, for me, I always find interesting. So when I'm writing, or even when I'm reading, I think I think Ozzy and Thirii might be familiar with this in terms of my live readings. When I read my poems, I have a lot of space on the page in a lot of my poetry. So I have a lot of white space in between phrases, in between words. So I think of those phrases and words as chords, as notes, and then when the transition happens, there's this silence that occurs. So if you ever come to any of my live readings, if I read some of my line poetry, I like to invoke a lot of silence in between the line breaks and the seijoras and the white spacing of the page. So, if there's one thing in terms of music that influences me a lot, is silence, is pausing, between paragraphs, between words, between sentences. And it really creates this atmosphere for me that feels calm, meditative, and that whenever I read other people's poetry and I see, like after the line break, maybe the next line doesn't appear until, 5 or 8 spaces down. I'd like to just, participate in that moment, because I feel like silence also sort of shapes the words and the meanings much more. For me, it becomes much more of an experience. So yeah, when I'm thinking about music, that's how that's my relationship to music, at least when it comes to my work. But most of the time, I remember when I first wrote Bone Light, my first book, I was listening to a lot of, sort of indie, like bands like Modest Mouse, bands like Nirvana. When I wrote letters, I was listening to a lot of Joy Division, so and those are interesting bands for me that that are also part of my process when I start to write and create art. So I hope that answers your question, Valerie. So.
Totally. You both answered my question in completely different and beautifully complementary ways. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. One of my questions was actually going to be about the way that you both collaborate with silence on the page, because visually your pages as well, in the nonfiction book Thirii have a lot of silence and white space that surrounds the prose sections. And I think about the different things that those spaces or silences, like the different ways that they're exerting pressure on the language that does exist on the page, and how my experience as a reader is that it's actually those white spaces that are like doing the work of like remapping and contesting certain colonial paradigms. And I find that so incredible, because I know the level of technical craft skill that requires to hone in, like sculpt something down to its essence, but to give the reader an experience of the negative space as well that's very embodied and full. So I you don't have to answer that. You already spoke to that beautifully, because we do have another comment. I think it's more comment than a question, and I want to use the last couple of minutes we have for Armand's last question, because I know he read your work very carefully, but there was somebody in the comments, an audience member, who was just talking about the experience of synesthesia. So I'll throw that in the mix and pass it over to you, Armand.
Yeah, my other question was also related to like craft and creative writing in general for both of you. It seems to me that you both use it as both as a site of innovation and a site of resistance. And you both adhere to certain forms and conventions of writing, but also flout others, right? And I wanted to ask, what informs these choices, and what rules and traditions to you are worth following and which are better left ignored? And how does like creation and resistance, this sense of like play and defiance, how does those two things coexist in your work?
I'll try to keep this short. Earlier, there was some talk about, you were mentioning something, Ozzy, and also Thirii, about time. And I was thinking about when I think about time from the perspective of being a Dene person, time is really non-existent to a certain extent. It's time is sort of, I guess maybe the best way I could say it in a very sort of cheesy way is this notion of sacred time. And in the context of literature, I was thinking of these two wonderful essays, one by Paula Gunn Allen, which is called The Sacred Hoop, in which, she writes about how stories are told, for example, that European tradition is sort of based in this linear way of telling a story. So if you imagine it in terms of a shape, European storytelling would be a Fri Dec pyramid, right? Would be a pyramid where, you have the exposition, climax, denouement, right? But Polygon Allen, I think in The Sacred Hoot, her essay sort of uses the shape of a circle. So the idea that plot doesn't exist, right? That the story can sort of begin on any part of the shape of the circle, which really, you know, sort of resists this idea of, I guess, linear storytelling. One of my favorite Native writers is a writer named Leslie Marmon Silko. And Leslie Marmon Silko has this wonderful essay called Language and Literature from a Pueblo Indian Perspective. And she talks about how, in that particular essay, how words expand, right? How a single word has other words inside it, but these words are telling stories. And so then when a word has another word in it and it's telling stories, it's constantly expanding. And she sort of uses this image of a spider web, that, you know, that the spider is sort of like the storyteller, right? The person who is telling the story and sort of weaving, you know, this sort of circular, intricate, expansive pattern of words, of language, of stories. You know, for me, that has been very influential for me as a Dene writer, you know, thinking about that poetics from a Laguna Pueblo perspective, right? But also thinking about, you know, even in my own culture, you know, one of the last concrete poems I shared, the last concrete poem, which was in the shape of a rectangle, is in Dene culture, we have rugs. So our Dene rugs, our Navajo rugs, traditionally are woven upright. So, and there's this thing called chewinte. It sort of translates to the exit way. So if you ever look at an old Navajo rug, and usually it's in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see a line that's usually a different color. That's referred to as the exit way, or some people call it the spirit line. So the idea of this line that sort of exits the rug is a type of imperfection, but it's also aesthetically the idea that the energy of the weaver goes into the rug, and through the spirit line, through the exit way, the energy of that artist, of that weaver is able to exit. So that energy will continue. So that means that the Navajo weaver, the Dene rug weaver, is able to sort of continue weaving, right? It's very similar to an essay I was influenced by, which was written by Charles Olson, called Projective Verse. So Olson says the same thing, right? That the energy of the poet goes into the page, the energy transfers from the page to the reader or the listener. So, for me, the native poetics, native aesthetics, right, have very much influenced me in my process and my work. And, whether it's Polygon Allen, Leslie Marmon Silko, Sharon Batsui, or, Rexley Jem, these are all sort of native writers who are writing from that particular perspective, right? And that's the contribution to English, right? That's how English is able to be shaped and expand further, is because we have all these perspectives that we're coming from, right? That are very specific. I may write in English, but underneath it is an energy of me being a Dene person, a Dene writer. So I think maybe I'm sort of ranting now, sorry. I hope that answers your question, Armand.
That was really beautiful, Orlando. Thank you for sharing. Sharing that part about the energy of the weaver having this like escape. That's really resonant with me, and it's getting my wheels turning, though I'm not yet able to fold it into my answer to Armand's question. So yeah, thank you, Armand. Thank you for engaging with and reading our text. That's really, it always is just incredible to see people doing that. I have a conflicted relationship with the word resistance, or the idea of my writing being an act of resistance or defiance, partly because, at least for me with creative writing, and I mean, I feel like I'm able to write in other modes that are more tinged with resistance or defiance as the sort of register. But with creative writing, it's such a like vulnerable, tender space for me that it's often not a space where I'm able to inhabit that hardness or that anger, maybe even that something like resistance would require. Although maybe hearing myself speak, I'm wondering if I've had too narrow a definition of what resistance could be. And maybe what I'm talking about, or what I will talk about, could also be a form of resistance, even if it's not about like having hard boundaries, because maybe in a way like softness and vulnerability is a form of resistance. But anyway, I think for me with writing, it's more about creating a safe space for myself to do, not even for myself, but for the writing to do whatever it needs to do, without the interference of intrusive thoughts about the market, about publishing, about what I'm allowed to write about how the work will be received. It's sort of like, for me, it's about creating a space in which the work can just breathe and be itself, and figure out what itself is. I think this ties to maybe opacity. I've just been thinking about opacity because we had a speaker come through Amherst recently who was talking about glissance, the right to opacity from Poetics of Relation, and how for marginalized writers in Anglophone world, like opacity can be a way to resist the ethnographic mandate that we have on our shoulders to, explain to our audience what it's like to be X, Y, or Z. And I think that's kind of what I'm talking about too. That safe space is created by this dome of opacity, where I am saying that my family or like my interiority is private, and I'm not trying to hang laundry out to dry, right? I'm not trying to sell my culture or whatever, my experiences, and I'm not trying to be a reality TV star, right? Like I am just trying to create art and trying to have that art received on its own terms. And I think another way to explain this is through thinking about, for example, a stereotype, right? A stereotype is something that shackles a person regardless of whether you fit into it or not, because it exists. One is always having to negotiate the existence of the stereotype. So for example, like I teach this class called Asian American Writing Across and Between Genres at Amherst, and I'm teaching it again in the spring. And I have them read as one of the first texts, the first essay from Kathy Park Hong's Minor Feelings called United, which is and I don't think it's the perfect essay, but I teach it because it's a very concise introduction for people who may not be familiar with Asian American history, But within that essay, she has this one part where she talks about this like frustration that she feels when she's, and Kelly Park Hong is a Korean American woman, and she's a professor, this frustration that she feels in the classroom when she has an Asian American female student who's quiet. And she feels frustrated with those students because she feels like, why are they being quiet? Why don't they speak out? You know, why aren't they loud? And I think that's such an interesting moment for me in that essay, because it speaks to how even Kathy Park Hong, who has written this whole book about Asian American identity, isn't immune to the stereotype, right? Like, if she had a white student who was quiet, would she have that same frustration with that person? Or do you know what I mean? Like, there's this way in which as soon as the stereotype exists, we cannot escape from it. And I feel that too, because sometimes when I'm in the classroom and I'm quiet, I'm like, okay, am I being quiet because I'm Asian, because I'm an immigrant, or is this how I'm going to be read? And if I am loud, then am I going to be read as being a brown Asian who's too loud? You know what I mean? There's never an escape. But anyway, I'm using the example of this like pervasive, intrusive stereotype as an example of what I'm trying to put out of my mind when I enter the creative space. Because if I allow those stereotypes and other types of dominant narratives to enter the creative space, then it's very difficult to write. It's very difficult to write. So I've based, for me, like the writing process is one of boundaries, enacting boundaries for myself and for my imagination that allow it to be itself and have some space in this world that is what it is, where something can be itself and something can, and doesn't have to be defined by these external intrusive ideas and structures.
Thank you to both of you for those very generous answers.
Yeah, thank you, Armand. I just really quick, I was just listening to you, Thirii, about, you know, when non-natives come here to teach. I teach at my tribe's college. So I teach at Dec College, which is my tribe's college. So I've been here for about 13 years, but whenever non-natives come here to teach Dec students, when they teach here, our students here are very quiet. Like, they don't say anything, even probably for the whole semester, you know? But what's interesting about that is that we come from a culture, I don't know about Burmese culture, but I know for Dec culture is we come from a culture of listening. So, you know, like when we grow up out here, we just listen to elders and people who are older. You know, we listen to, you know, and so when we're in an academic setting, right, the expectation in terms from an American perspective is that, you know, when you're asked a question, you need to answer, right? And our students here, they don't do that. It's not that they're not listening, they are listening. But yeah, most of the time when it comes to conversations, you know, it's very frustrating for a lot of non-natives who come out here to teach, because, you know, you'll be lucky if you get one student to speak up, you know, for, you know, like all semester. Anyway, when you were talking about that silence, right, that of how, you know, when we're thinking about, you know, the context of those expectations, right, from those expectations of being an American, whatever that means, and what that, you know, and how that's sort of projected on us, whether we're native or immigrant, or, you know, it's yeah. Anyway, I just wanted to comment on that. So
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Orlando. I was going to say one more thing, actually, tied back to Armand's question, but your comment just made me think of, is that in a way that silence can also be a type of like tongue-in-cheek resistance, or like using people's stereotypes against them. Because like, for example, my mom is a very loud person, so she's definitely not a quiet, silent person. But when she's in public spaces and people annoy her and they ask her direct questions, she just won't respond and literally will just ignore people. And I always thought it was really funny because other people would just take it as like, oh, this Asian woman doesn't understand English. But really, it's just her not having the time of day to engage with people she finds annoying. So I always thought that was like a funny example of kind of tongue-in-cheek resistance using people's like racism against them.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, both of you for just being here with us, and you know, for everything that you've shared. And I think that it's been such a pleasure to hear you be in conversation with each other, and the richness of the conversation I'm going to think about for some time, and hopefully we'll find other ways to stay engaged with each other. So thank you very much to you, Thirii, to you, Orlando, and Armand, for your hard work and your presence, and to our audience members for joining us today. We went way over time, and people stuck along, so we really appreciate that. Next month, I'm going to be in conversation with the writer Chelsea T. Hicks from the Osai Nation, and we invite you all to join us for that. It's just, I believe, happening in early January, but the link to our January 27th, my apologies, and the event is titled Reconnecting to Matrilineal Homes. So we look forward to seeing you again then, and this recording will be sent to you via email after the event, and we appreciate you again, Thirii and Orlando. Take care of yourselves, and see you in the future.